Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. I'm excited to be joined by some of our esteemed faculty with the Goizueta Business School. The Emory Alumni Association, together with Goizueta Business School, Goizueta Executive Education Programming, and our executive corporate partners are proud to deliver this in-depth series presented by our faculty and executive thought leaders on how executives have to adapt to a challenging business landscape. With the pandemic fully upon us, we see it quite fitting to move forward in launching the series by addressing what it means to practice business during and eventually after a public health pandemic and how to lead in uncertainty. This is the first in our series, so please do stay in touch as future programs are coming online. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nicola Barrett, who can introduce our guest.
Thank you, Lane, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm the Chief Corporate Learning Officer at Emory Executive Education at Goizueta Business School. We work with organizations and their executives and professionals to bring the thought leadership and teaching excellence of the Goizueta faculty together to equip business leaders with the mindsets, the skill sets, and the tool sets they need to meet their organization's challenges today and tomorrow. One thing that has captured our imaginations is the organization of the future and the challenge of creating and capturing growth, especially now as we think about how to operate in a global economy and in communities impacted by COVID-19. We believe that interesting opportunities often lie at the intersection of disciplines, which is why today's session is being led by a management accountant and a marketer. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Karen Sedatole, who is the Interim John H. Harlan Dean of the Goizueta Business School and the Goizueta Advisory Board Term Professor of Accounting. Karen is a three-time recipient of the American Accounting Association's Notable Contributions to Management Accounting Research Award, based on her pioneering research into the field of performance measurement and reward systems, the role of forecasting and budgetary systems within organizations, and control in interorganizational collaborations. In her research, she considers the role of trust, positive motivation, and systems thinking in the workplace. It is also my pleasure to introduce Omar Rodriguez, who is an associate professor in the practice of marketing at Goizueta Business School. His research focuses on two areas. First, how firms are evolving their marketing capabilities in order to compete in technology-led market environments. And then also how environmental and social sustainability considerations are changing the nature of marketing activities. Prior to his career in academia, Omar held leadership positions in marketing at the Coca-Cola Company, including serving as the Global Vice President of Integrated Marketing Communications and Integrated Marketing Director for Coca-Cola China. So we are in excellent hands for this conversation for the next hour. So let me start, Omar, with many people refer to the post-COVID-19 era as the new normal. So when are we going to get to the new normal? You don't. You refer to it as the next normal. Why is that?
Yeah, thank you, Nicola, and welcome everybody. I'm excited to be here with you today. I think that part of the change in mindset that I believe executives need to incorporate is that when we think about it from the standpoint of a new normal, there's an implied permanence in that statement. There's a sense that we will be experiencing a new state that's going to be just as stable as the one prior to COVID, in which we're going to compete. We know it's not going to be the same. We know it's going to be different, but it's going to be stable. And I don't think the reality that we're going to face over the next 2 years or so is going to be as stable. That's why I prefer thinking about it from the standpoint of a next normal, just to imply that we can't really be expecting permanence. We need to be planning to behave and operate in an environment that's more transient. And from the perspective of a chief marketing officer, what is normal? And normal means really the structure of the market being stable. And by that mean consumer preferences being stable, habits being stable. And we know that in the last 2 months, all of that has been up for grabs, right? How many of us have changed our habits in the last 2 months in big and small ways? Many things in the way that we did in our lives have been altered. And when that happens, as we re-enter a new economy, some of those old habits may stay, but some of the new habits would also stay. All of that shaping a new marketplace that is going to be filled with opportunities for companies to find new unmet needs to drive growth. And also for those that don't see the change, then that may imply that there will be some losing streaks along the way. McKinsey has done some research recently to looking at this and how consumers' preferences is shaping. And actually, I wanted to ask you that question. Like, if we could go into the poll, how much have you changed, or of the following areas that I'm going to show in this poll? Which ones do you think have experienced the greatest growth in terms of new users? And these are areas that have been impacted heavily by new technology. So if we could think about online retail or digital exercise services like, I don't know, Peloton, or online entertainment like Netflix, or telemedicine or online learning, which of these do you think has experienced the greatest growth in new users over the last 2 months?
Oh, we've got some great responses coming in, varied, very close in some categories. We'll give everyone just another second or two to participate. These are really interesting and close.
I can't see the results. Who's winning right now?
Oh, it's close, but telemedicine's winning. I'm going to give everybody one more second, and then I'll share.
Let's see.
The 63% telemedicine.
Who won? Telemedicine?
Yeah, 63% telemedicine, 53% online learning.
Nice, I'm impressed. I mean, online learning is right there. I'm starting to think that maybe you got a hold of this report too. So let me show you the results. And in fact, they were a little bit surprising to me too. And if we go to the next slide, you will see the percentage of people, and this is they calculated new users as the percentage of people that reported to be adopting the new technology because of the last 2 months versus the percentage of people that were using it normally. And just as you guys kind of voted, telemedicine is number one with 173% increase in terms of new users, followed by learning, and all the way down in the bottom is entertainment. And now part of it is the size of this change is impacted by the size of the base, right? Like many of us already use digital solutions and services for our entertainment, like Netflix, right? So the growth of new users is still remarkable, but it's not comparable to other areas where the services became very valuable and they were not really adopted. Now, importantly, in this study, they went ahead and they also looked at, well, how likely are you to keep some of these new habits that you're incorporating into your lives over the last 2 months? And in the next slide, you will see that it's really, well distributed. There are some of these aspects that are very high in growth of new users, like telemedicine, particularly for physical services, but also mental services, as well, learning, particularly for kids. Those experienced the greatest growth. But then when we looked on the other side, we see activities that maybe did not include a lot of growth, but are still expected to be part of our lives after this pandemic is over. Now, what I want you to pay attention to, and my slides are not moving, but I'm hoping that you're seeing the updated version on your end. What I want you to pay attention to is that the percentage of people that are reporting that they're going to continue some of these new behaviors is fairly high overall. If you go to the next slide, where you actually have the names of the activities, it's 40%, 50%, 60% of people reporting like, yeah, I maybe was not used to maybe learning online or doing video conference online or using grocery delivery, but still 40% of the people are saying that they started are reporting that they're going to continue it. So there is a lagging effect here. And all of these are new habits that are entering the marketplace, creating, as I said earlier, the next normal, a new condition that I think is going to open up many opportunities for companies to find new growth.
So Omar, how do you begin? Where do you start preparing as a marketer for this next normal?
Well, I think that the first place to go is, and if we could go to the next slide, is this idea of playbooks that many managers use to drive efficiency in the way we seek growth, right? We find a program that works, and we create a playbook to make sure that other people in the organization can replicate it. And that drives scale, and it makes it more efficient. However, playbooks are conditional to a particular environment. And if the environment changes, the playbook may not work as it used to. The last thing I would say is that playbooks are not only physical activities, that programs and promotions that you do. Playbooks also exist in our minds, our mental models about that we have based on our years of experience about how growth happens, about what matters and what doesn't matter, about what resources are better or worse for a given situation. And the reason why I suggest hide your playbooks is don't get rid of them, but don't see the new landscape through the lens of your old playbooks, through the lens of your mental models. You need to find a way, like in the next slide, I have this phrase that I really like, which is to almost like reimagine, defamiliarize yourself with the marketplace you knew. And this is a term that was used by Adam Brothenberg in his HBR article about to change the way you think, you have to change the way you see, right? And he talks about the fact that when you defamiliarize yourself with something that you're intimately aware of, you begin to discover new opportunities. And artists use this technique all the time. So the same applies to us. Now we're entering a new landscape that's going to have new habits that have been altered and changed. We cannot bring our old mental models with us. Defamiliarize yourself. And a good way of defamiliarizing yourselves is to look at the market through the lens of the customer, not through the lens of your products, through the lens of your processes and your manufacturing and your competitors. All of that is, put it aside for now. Get yourself in the shoes of your customers, particularly those that don't buy from you, not only the ones that love you, and try to see the world through their lens.
So Karen, through the lens of the managerial accountant and the leader of an organization, what do you think about Omar's comments right there?
Well, first of all, Nicola, thank you for the introduction, and I'm also happy to be here. So Omar, it's so interesting to think about the current and the next normal in our own, I guess, personal experience as consumers. And you're right, my household is behaving very differently right now, and it's unclear even to us how we're going to behave in the long term, if we're going to go back to the way we've been, or if we are going to have our own next normal. And of course, thinking about this from an organizational perspective, the responsibility of responding and adapting to these next normals belongs really to everyone in an organization. And so, being able to respond requires some, organizational agility, adaptability, so that we can respond to these new possibilities that this next normal has uncovered. But also while dealing within the constraints of the reality of what we're facing, and constraints including resource constraints, financial constraints. And so from an organizational perspective, it's going to require very deliberate and increased prioritization of the resources that we have available to meet these new challenges. And I would emphasize that the key to doing that is to have a very, very clear understanding of what the strategy of the organization is. So Omar's talking about the landscape and the opportunities. So we have to translate that into the organizational structure and the strategy that we are going to pursue. And we have to align decision-making throughout the organization, all levels of the organization, from the CEO on down to customer-facing hourly workers, to get everybody aligned with respect to their decision-making, so that we can meet, the long-term and short-term objectives that we need to execute the strategy. So it turns out that many companies struggle with it as well. The leaders at the highest level of the organization, the C-suite, if you will, they may have a good sense of what strategy is, and they may have have a good idea of where we're going to go in this next normal. But the organization as a whole is oftentimes ill-prepared to actually execute on that. And part of the problem is somewhat a lack of a communication. So we see a lot of companies struggling with communications. I'm not talking about the budget communications. I'm talking about really the big picture, strategic ideals of the organization and the objectives that they're trying to achieve. So I think I'd like to ask our participants. We're going to have another poll. I'd like to ask our participants to think about how much time on average that you see strategy being discussed in your organization. So about how many hours a week do the people around you, your leaders, your cohorts, your teams talk about strategy?
We've got another great variety of responses. Give everyone a little more time to participate. Looks like we have a pretty interesting leader. All right, give everybody just another minute. All right, this one's a little more clear. We're going to share that. 34% have 4 to 5 hours a week.
4 to 5 hours a week. That's actually quite high. If you could go to the next slide. This was a broad scale survey of leaders of medium to large organizations. And they posed this question about how much time is spent really thinking about strategy. And 86% of the executive teams reported they spend less than an hour per month discussing strategy. Now that's executive teams. So if you think about lower levels of the organization, I think that the general takeaway is that there's not a lot of time being devoted to this. 70% of the organizations that responded to this particular survey do not link middle management incentives to strategy. So that suggests that there's really not, an incentive to discuss that strategy. And 60% of organizations report that they don't link strategy to resource allocation. So in thinking about budgeting, for example, they tend to not think, 60% of organizations say they tend to not try to tie that back to strategic objectives. So I guess it's not that surprising then that most of those companies, 95% according to this poll, report that the typical workforce, so I think lower levels in the organization, does not understand the organization's strategy. And 90% believe that their organizations are failing to execute strategy successfully. So those are some interesting numbers, and it suggests to me that there's quite a bit of improvement that needs to happen out there in the business community. Now, why is this the case? Why is communications about strategy lacking, and why are so many companies feel like they're not executing well? We have to remember that organizations, even medium-sized organizations, are really complex ecosystems, decision-making ecosystems. So if you can go to the next slide, please. The decision-making in these organizations is complex in a number of ways. The decisions themselves are complex. We distribute decision rights across an organization, so we have people all over the organization responsible for different choices that the organization makes. But it's complex in part because these decisions that different people are making are interdependent. So Omar, a decision you might make in marketing could very well affect a decision that I might make in terms of the finance side of the organization, and certainly the other way around as well. It's often the case that some of our decisions have lagged consequences. So I make a decision today, and I don't really know if it's the right decision for another quarter, 2 quarters, maybe even a year down the road. And they're also history dependent. So decision I make today can influence the decision set that I have available down the road. So decision making itself is very complex. Of course, the workplace is filled with all kinds of people, and the workforce is complex. Everybody brings different priorities, different understanding, different mental models to the decision-making process. And then lastly, the organizational structure itself is also complex. So there's oftentimes a lack of visibility about other people's decisions, and certainly about their motives or assumptions that underlie those decisions. And communication, just the task of communicating across, especially a large organization, can be quite difficult. So while the strategy execution is important to be able to take advantages of the things that Omar's talking about, you have to be mindful that this is all taking place in a very complex ecosystem.
So I'm hearing that as executives, we need to spend more time than we typically are doing in terms of formulating strategy, communicating strategy, and then also, given the times we're in, critically, we need to adopt a new mental model or models. Omar, is there a framework or an approach that managers can use to form this new mental model of a market that's constantly changing, or is that uncertain?
Yeah, and actually I want to build on what Karen was saying. She ended kind of reflecting on how complex of an ecosystem it is to manage, particularly a large organization, and manage it to growth. So therefore, part of the responsibility of the growth leaders is to help simplify the complexity, right? Like enable the strategy to align the organization, but that only happens if the strategy is simple enough, right? In addition to being compelling and robust. So one way to think about it is I want to share with you an example of a framework that we've been developing to help particularly CMOs, but I think it could apply broader than that, how to think about the choice of this new market. How do you compete in it through the lens of the customer? So I ended my remark talking about that, you need to kind of reimagine your market through the lens of the customer. How do you do that? So I'm going to show you some information from the general merchandise category. So Target, Walmart, retail stores. We're doing this research in 10 different industries, but this is one of them. I think that the starting point is start to define your industry and your market through the lens of specific attributes and benefits that customers are looking for. Right? And the term jobs to be done is one that has gained some speed, and a lot of companies, particularly CPG firms, are using it. That's a good lens to use. So what are the jobs to be done that customers are looking for right now in the market as they are entering into this particular sector, be it cleaners or cars or computers? And break it down into the list that you believe, based on your understanding of the customer, that's comprehensive enough. And then assess how important those are. And now in the next slide, I'll show you a map. We tested this in June 2019, way before, of course, anybody knew what was about to happen. So we have a baseline to compare. And this is in general merchandise industry. What this tells us is the importance in this making the decision about where to shop. How important are these different general attributes, right? Issues related to cost and cost saving, not surprisingly, dominant, about 20%. Then it's convenience, another close to 20%. So you have right there 40% of the decision about where am I going to shop driven by two factors, right? So if you're not competitive in those two factors, then you're not at least in this general market average. There may be a segment that cares about something else, and you may be competing there. Then after that, it's data privacy, about 16%, and quality of products are about 15%. So you have about 72% of the market decisions that are driven primarily by these four factors, and they've been pretty stable. Now we measured again last month in May, mid-May, and that's the next map. So think about this as the market structure, same category, but now during COVID, and notice the change. First, interestingly, there are some things that are still stable, that still matter. The 40% of cost and convenience is still there. The changes are too small, right? However, the second level did change. Service went down. Safety went up 3 times. It used to be 2%, it went up to 9%. Data privacy went down from 60% to 8%. So attention to societal benefits and social responsibility of companies went up from 2% to almost 8%. This is a change in market structure, meaning a change in what customers are looking for. So if you enter the new market with the prior map, thinking that 72% is all those 4 areas, you're out of sync, right? You're going to find difficulty regaining traction. Why? Because you're not in sync with the new map. So one way to take this further is to now look at it at the specific level. So we measured 24 different attributes, and in the next slide, you will get a short description of each. And these are the marginal probabilities of each attribute. This is how important they are, right, to consumers. So saving money, it's easy to buy, they protect my data, all the way down to it builds a community and helps me connect with other people. And each of these 24 attributes, they actually are representative of what we believe are 1 or 3 of the main categories of value that you need to focus on. And the first one are is a category of value which we call exchange, which is basically the value that is derived by customers in the moment of transaction, right? When I'm actually about to buy something, how easy it is for me to get what I want. And there are a number of attributes that we measure to represent that broader concept of exchange value. From there, we have a second category, which we call experience value. And that's basically, in addition to the moment of transaction, in the case of general merchandise, I spend some time at the store. I spend some time getting into the store. And there are some hassles, and there are conveniences, and there are enjoyments and delights or problems that I could experience all along the way. So how important are those in driving choice? So these are things like customer service and the quality of the product and enable safety practices. And then the last one is the meaning of the brand that you have built in my life, the relevancy. We call that engagement. And this is where things like how well you care for your employees, because that's increasingly something that consumers are looking at and care about, or your CSR, or do I feel included as part of your programs? So we have the same amount of benefits of attributes for each of these three categories. And now, these were derived using a conjoint-like methodology, and what you can do is you can add them up to get a sense of how important they are in total. And when you do that, the next slide, you will see that basically, if I have a general merchandise re-entering the market, the area where the greatest attention of value is on what we call the exchange value, right there, followed by experience-related attributes, and last is engagement-related attributes. So this is really important. This begins to give clarity to what type of capabilities do I need? What type of actions? Where should I be investing? I need to be investing in really making the exchange easy. Now, let's look at an example of a company that leveraged this. In the next slide, you will see, I want you to think about these three levels really as a model. Think of it like a configuration, right? And right now, Domino's, for instance, is a company that for the last 2 years have been investing at outbidding their rivals in the space of exchange. A lot through technology, a lot through their mobile app, and making that transaction really easy for us. Knowing how long it will take, making the payment really easy, making the choice really easy, remembering what we ordered last time, if we want to repeat, all of that. So they're dominating on exchange. Do they have the best pizza in the market? I think we would all agree. No, it's not an issue of having the best. They have an adequate pizza. They have improved on the quality a little bit, but they have a good enough pizza. But beating them on exchange, really hard, right? Now, think about another example, one that we all that live in Atlanta know very well, Delta. So when you think about Delta, and again, think about Delta in the way they're coming to market through the lens of this model, they're actually focusing on competing and creating value more on the experience area. Again, through their mobile app, how they have eliminated hassles across our travel journey, from letting us know how much traffic there is to the airport, to how many steps to get to the gate, or you're boarding now, or your luggage has been put on the plane and it's safe, or it's coming out terminal number 1, or all that information that we're now provided, they have enabled through this app. Think of it as them reducing pain points in our travel experience, and as a result creating value. It's not monetary value, but it's still valuable, because now if I have to travel to another airline that does not have that, the experience is not as good. So you're really looking at a switching cost that they have, a barrier to switching that they have created. So when you get to the next slide, basically, you can begin to think of your industry and your choice about how to compete in this next normal through the lens of these configurations. And there are different companies making different choices. This is not a choice that you make solely on what customers care. You also have to look at your current capabilities, your ability to stretch your organization, and all that. But this framework gives a way to adopt a customer-centric view of the next normal, but then bring it into the organization in a way that it makes it possible for you to make strategic choices about your capabilities and about your actions.
Thanks, Omar. Karen, so what are your thoughts on this? So we're throwing away the playbook, we're changing our mental models. This looks fabulous. I'm sort of in my mind thinking about what our map looks like in terms of Emory Executive Education. But what do you think from your experience around measuring organizational performance and designing management control systems?
So this idea of throw away the playbook, or I guess hide the playbook. I mean, I'm an accountant, so that kind of makes me a little bit nervous. But where Omar is coming from is the need to set aside previously maintained assumptions when thinking about the market and how growth is going to occur and what customer needs and wants are, and the value that your organization with your capabilities can deliver. So in that sense, I completely understand where he's coming from. And I agree that hiding the playbook allows you to see those opportunities. But of course, there's the organizational side of that as well. And it's on that side of the equation that I think the playbooks actually become important. So if you can go to the next slide. If you think about an organization's strategy, you know, it's got several elements. It's got the clearly articulated objectives. That's the ends that the strategy is designed to achieve. But in order to execute, you have to make choices. So a strategy is about how to make those choices. That includes, you know, where are we going to play? So all of these things that Omar is raising, you know, what are the jobs to be done? What are we going to focus on? Are we going to focus on exchange or experience or engagement? And so those are all going to be choices that have to be made. And trade-offs have to be made within the organization to make sure you're delivering the element that you've decided is going to be your focus. But there's also choices to be made related to everyday activities that have to be executed, have to be undertaken. And also, again, choices about resources, how resources will be deployed. And so if you take Omar's end of the equation, which is, you know, we need to think more openly and freely about what the market needs and wants are, and figure out what value we can bring to the table, bring to the market. But then behind that, you need the organizational structure to be able to deliver on that. So if you can go to the next slide. So if you think about executing strategy, you know, there's four different, you know, ways we can look at that. You know, a strategy, of course, you're going to have some financial goals. So I like to think about it as four different areas of focus. So we've got our financial goals. You know, how do we want to look to our shareholders? And then you have the customer value proposition. Now this is what Omar is talking about, that is so key to being able to adapt to the next normal and to be successful and take advantage of the opportunity. But then behind that, in order to be able to deliver that value to customers, you have to think about, okay, now what do we need to do internally really well? Where do we need to achieve operational excellence? And then you need to be thinking about and preparing to develop the capabilities that we need within the organization in order to be able to achieve that operational excellence so that we can deliver the customer value proposition, ultimately giving the shareholders what they are looking for, which is value creation. So the question then becomes, how do you do that? How do you mobilize this very complex workforce and arm them with the tools that they need to make all these very important decisions every day, day in and day out? And this is where an internal playbook, I think, can be very useful. So I have an analogy that I like to think about. If you want to go to the next slide, I think about a job where I have somebody a very specific job. So Omar, let's say that I need you as one of my employees. I need you to drive to Texas. And I don't tell you exactly where in Texas you're going, and I don't tell you exactly what you're going to do. But I say, don't worry, Omar, I'm going to give you a GPS. And here I've already programmed in the location, and I'm going to mount it to your dashboard. And don't worry, you don't need to know how to work the GPS. You just start driving. And so that's a little bit like trying to execute a strategy without a playbook, without an internal operational playbook. And you know, what happens if Omar comes to a point where there's a bridge that's out? And now he doesn't know where he's going. He's not really sure exactly, you know, how to get there. All he's been doing is every day following the little GPS. Think about this a different way. Let's suppose I gave Omar instead a map, and I gave Omar the exact address where I wanted him to go and exactly what I wanted him to do when he got there. And I showed him on the map and I oriented him. Here is north, south, east, west, and here's where we're trying to go. And I've done all the research, and here's the route I think that you should be taking. And so I arm him with those tools, and he knows where he's going and why, and he knows the plan for how to get there and why we've come up with that plan. But again, I recognize as a leader that things happen. Things happen like we've seen. The next normal happens. And so I also tell Omar, I want you checking in at least once a day, maybe every time you stop. I want you to check in, and I'm going to give you updated information. And also, I need you to give me updated information on what you've discovered along the path. In part, so I can help you adjust to that next normal, and in part, so I can share that information with other people in the organization. So now when Omar comes across a bridge that's out, he's got a map. He knows where he's trying to get. He knows sort of the principles of getting there. And he can adjust himself, but he can also communicate back with the leadership and give more insights that can be shared. And that's how I think about executing a strategy. You know, I say, you know, you wouldn't drive to Texas without a map. Why would you drive your organization or team without a map? So there's a tool that I use when I'm working with executives in my classes or in executive education or even in my research. If you want to go to the next slide. And it's a similar kind of tool that I'm describing. And it's a way to provide that map and the orientation and the information to the rest of an organization. And it's a map for your strategy. It's a strategy map. So you can see in this diagram, the different perspectives I was talking about a moment ago. At the top of the strategy map is what we call the financial perspective. You know, what do we want to try to achieve from a financial perspective? What are our financial goals, whether it's revenue growth, market share? You know, what is it that we need to do to deliver financial value for our shareholders? But then right below that is that customer perspective, what Omar has been focusing on. You know, what are the jobs to be done? You know, what are our objectives for delivering value to our customers? And Omar made a point that could differ from one organization to another. One organization might focus on objectives related to the quality of the exchange or the experience or the level of engagement. So we can think about what are our objectives for the customer value proposition. And then just below that is what we call the internal perspective. This is that operational excellence. What do we need to do internally in order to deliver that customer value proposition? Do we need to have excellent on-time delivery? Do we need to have excellent customer interface in the tools that we give our customers, whether it's a phone app? What are the things we need to do really well related to our supply chain, for example? And then below that, we have what we call the learning and growth. This is about those capabilities. What are the capabilities we need to develop in the organization? That's human capabilities, that may be information capital, technology abilities. And if we take all of these perspectives and we take each one of these separately and think and identify and enumerate specific objectives, then that's going to provide a sort of a map. And it's important to think not just what the individual objectives are, but how they relate to each other. I describe this as a strategy map as being a set of objectives with each of those perspectives, but linked and a cause and effect linkage. So if I do this, it will allow me to better do that. So we need to illuminate those linkages. And this is about uncovering assumptions. You know, it's a way to really be explicit. I am assuming that if I do this internally, I'll be better able to deliver this source of value to my customer externally. So it's a way to think about cause and effect linkages, and it's a way to think about that map to that strategy execution. And we've seen organizations use this very effectively as a communication tool, because you can share these strategy maps, and people lower levels of the organization can really begin to understand their role in executing that strategy. Their role on a day-to-day basis may affect just one of those many objectives on the strategy map, but at least they know what their role is and how it fits into the bigger picture. So this is going to help us make these trade-offs. As an example, we might have a tendency facing a financial crisis where there might be a tendency to do across-the-board cost cutting. I would suggest that armed with a strategy map, we will be able to figure out, you know, where we might want to be cutting costs, and where, in fact, even in the financial crisis, we might want to increase our investment. So a strategy map is very helpful. It's a tool that's very helpful to begin to make those trade-offs.
So Omar, this is where you put up your hand and say, yes, marketing.
No, I really like it. And I like the fact at the top where we're looking at both revenue growth strategy as well as productivity strategies. Mm-hmm. So taking cost out is just as important as bringing new, top line growth in. And then it's a very, not only comprehensive, but well-balanced view of the organism that's required to drive growth. I like it.
Mm-hmm. So Karen, how do we know, and particularly, in our current environment, how do we know if the strategy is a good one, and how do we know we're effectively executing it? Because I remember from your previous chart that the execution piece was huge in terms of what 90% thereabouts companies not executing on their strategy.
So once you have the map and you have the objectives, internally, we typically assess strategy execution through the monitoring of performance. So we need sensors that will allow us to measure whether or not we're meeting every single one of these objectives. So we can talk about and think about, well, what are the ways we can take all of these strategic objectives and translate those into a comprehensive set of meaningful performance metrics. This is where this idea of a balanced scorecard comes in, and needing metrics that assess not just financial performance, so not just return on assets or revenue growth, but we really do need to be monitoring metrics that assess whether or not we are effectively meeting the needs of the customer, whether we're delivering the value that we intended to deliver from the customer point of view, and whether or not we're achieving excellence in the aspects of our operations, and whether or not we're developing the capabilities that we need within the organization. So we can translate every one of these objectives in this strategy map, into one or more performance measures that will help us monitor whether we're meeting those objectives. And the balance comes from needing measures that are reflecting, well, first of all, balance in all of these perspectives, the financial and the customer and the internal operations, but also balance in terms of short-term metrics versus long-term metrics, and just really thinking about measures that can help us assess very holistically whether or not we're executing that strategy. Now, there's a word of caution here, and that is that we oftentimes identify a set of metrics, and we oftentimes use those as a way to communicate, rightly so, appropriately so, what is important in the organization for the execution of the strategy. But sometimes we lose sight of the fact that metrics are that, they're just metrics. So I have an analogy I like to think about. If you could go to the next slide. There's a famous allegory. Plato talks about the allegory of the cave. And the allegory of the cave is a story that is told about some prisoners that are locked in a cave, chained down. You can see here they're chained down to their chairs, and they're looking at the back wall of the cave. And behind them, between them and the opening of the cave, is a large fire, and the fire is casting shadows on the wall of the cave. And the prisoners, they can only see the shadows. But if you can see in the picture, there's other individuals holding up objects. They're holding up the objects, and the prisoners are seeing the shadows on the wall. And if you ask the prisoners, what's behind you? They might say, well, there's a cat, or there's a table, or there's a chair. But in reality, what's behind them is just a two-dimensional representation of those things. And so I use this as a way to think about performance measures, because performance measures are the shadow. And what we really care about is the thing that's behind us, which is sort of the truth. So what I mean by that is what we really care about, for example, is making customers happy through, for example, the experience, the Delta example that Omar gave. What we really want is a great customer experience. We might measure that with a customer pulse satisfaction survey. It's really important to remember that the measure is just a reflection of the true thing that we're trying to capture. And the danger comes in when we or other people in the organization forget about that, and they focus so much on the measure itself and improving that measure that they lose sight of what we're really trying to do. And we've seen many examples out there where things have gone wrong. A simple example would be Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo had as a measure number of accounts open for customer. Of course, what they really wanted was to develop true customer relationships. So just a word of warning there about how to think about performance measures.
If I can build, Karen, on what you said, I think in addition to the measure part, as we are entering this next normal, I think it's important to think about signals. And you mentioned that at the beginning. So, the measures allows us to assess success, and ROI and all of that, and good use of our resources. But the signals tells us if we're heading in the right direction or not before those outcomes are generated. And in a transient environment, signals can be just as important. One way of doing it, which many companies have adopted, is social media listening with platforms like Crimson Hexagon or Social Bakers. But they become embedding sensors in the customer journey such that you can assess in real time how things are going in kind of the changing times that we're going to get into. It becomes a very important aspect of preparing for the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you say that, because more and more we have access to these customer-facing sensors out there, and we get them in real time. And they're oftentimes can be a leading indicator of what's going to be happening down the road. And part of when I'm talking about a balanced scorecard is being able to tap into those leading indicators, not just historical measures of what was our earnings last period, but these leading indicators of, what is the customer sentiment out there? And that's going to give us an idea how those customers are going to behave in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So, Omar, are there any other thoughts that you have in terms of critical things to position us for growth into this sort of next normal?
Well, I think that it's impossible not to consider the last 2 weeks. Right? It's impossible not to think that we can enter the next normal without bringing what has happened and also what that has caused us all to reflect and act on to be part of it. So, and maybe when we get into the Q&A, we can discuss some more about it. But I believe that the challenge to managers as we progress is to think about what is the role that our organization has in securing greater equality and contributing to greater social justice, particularly for people of color. And that Black Lives Matter, and that this is something that needs to become not only a policy or a stand, it needs to become a part of our job description in everywhere in the organization, not only the role of an HR manager or a chief diversity officer. So I think those considerations are central to the way we walk our way towards the next one.
Yeah.
Karen, anything from you as the leader now of Goizueta Business School?
Yeah, so I've been obviously thinking about some of these issues quite a lot as well. And I've been in this session talking about the importance of a map, a strategy map and performance measures. And these are all ways in which we can try to align the decisions and the behaviors of the people in the organization with what we're trying to achieve. But there's plenty of evidence that another powerful influencer of behavior is the culture of the organization. And the culture that is, I think, shaped by the leadership of the organization. And so that is something that, to Omar's point, is going to become extremely important as we, as a society and as a business organizations, try to think about, well, what does business look like in this context? So at Goizueta, we have as a part of our platform, as part of who we are, is thinking about training business leaders within the context of society. We think about it as just business and society. And the culture of an organization is paramount to that. It goes right along hand in hand with all of the other tools that we have by which to influence the actions and choices of the people throughout the organization.
Thank you. Thank you both. Lane, why don't I hand it back to you, because I think you've got some questions from the audience.
Great. Thanks so much to our wonderful presenters, and thank you, Nicola, for being our moderator. Just a quick reminder to all of our attendees, if you have any questions, please type them in the question box. We'll get to as many of those as we can in our last remaining minutes. One of the questions has come through: crisis management used to be seen as a strength. And being a leader now, how do you impose crisis management throughout your organization?
So there's a couple different kinds of crises, I think, that we can think about. There's crises that sort of emerge over time, and this can be, and they tend to be sort of self-imposed, self-created. The example I gave a few moments ago of the Wells Fargo, they certainly found themselves in a situation of crisis, but it was in some sense created by their own actions, the actions of people in the organization. The other type of a crisis would be a crisis that's imposed upon you through no fault of your own, through the external environment. And that's certainly what we're living through today in terms of our response to the COVID epidemic. For both of them, I think that the importance of crisis management is still is paramount. And I would argue, though, that the way forward through a crisis can be significantly easier, maybe not easy, but significantly easier if we have the elements in place that we've been talking about. If we have, a clear direction of what our customer value is that we're trying to provide, if everyone in the organization has a clear sense of the mission and the way, and a sense of this is how we do business. So that's that culture piece. And if everybody has a good understanding of what their individual choices and decisions that they make on a day-to-day basis, the impact that has on the rest of the organization and the ability to execute the strategy. So I would argue that these things we've been talking about today are a part of crisis management and will facilitate navigating through that and facilitate adapting to it. Because a lot of what we're seeing is companies adapting not only to the next normal of the market that they're viewing, but also the financial resources and constraints that the financial resources and constraints that we are finding, most companies are finding themselves in. And so being able to make those trade-offs is going to be easier if you have a good sense of how it is that you execute your strategy.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, as you consider to expand the capability of crisis management across the organization, accompany it with the idea of crisis leveraging. Allow people to think and approach crises, particularly those that are externally imposed on you, as really another form of an opportunity. And if it's something that is shared across your industry because it's a macro environment has changed and all of your rivals kind of are experiencing the same crisis, then even more so, right? Because then you are really competing with others on who's going to use this crisis to improve their organization, to improve their offering to the best, better than others. So take also a positive perspective on it.
And that's where it becomes important to build those capabilities, right, that I was talking about. And one of those capabilities might be to be able to turn a crisis situation into an opportunity, into identifying opportunities.
Thanks so much. This next question deals with social media marketing. The person asked, influencers have been used a lot in social media over the last several years. How do you see those people working in the next normal?
Becoming even more important. Frankly, as institutional trusts continue to erode, trust towards individuals grows. And that is, in my view, what's at the basis of the impact that influencers are having. I almost see them as micro media companies in their beginnings, and some of them are not micro anymore. Some of them are huge, right? And I don't see any market force that would prevent them from simply continuing to get more structured and bigger, and there's a continuous flow of new influencers by all kinds of interest areas. So it is, I consider it a core capability of an organization that's trying to compete 2 years ago and definitely in the next normal? How to have an influencer strategy? How do you build relationships with them that are authentic? And how do you find the right ones and motivate them to become part of your value creation process?
Another question has just come in. How do you know when to recalibrate your team as far as strategy changes?
So I'm not sure what recalibrate the team necessarily means. You can think about that, I guess, a couple of ways. You can think about recalibrating in terms of the team structure, rebuilding teams, or I guess you can think about recalibrating in the sense of refocusing the team on where you want them to go. So I guess I think we're probably always doing this. We're probably always recalibrating what we're doing. And the playbook that I'm talking about, or the map, the strategy map that I'm doing, I guess maybe I should clarify. It's not meant to be a static document. It's meant to be something that can be used as circumstances change. And so if your team is focused on a part of the execution of the strategy, as long as you know what the overall big picture is, what we're trying to achieve as an organization, then you can use the metrics that you're tracking, and you can use your understanding of how your decisions and your team affect others and are important to the delivery of the execution of the overall strategy. I think in some sense, we're always recalibrating our team in that way. I mean, Omar, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, so one signal I kind of pay attention to is coordination costs, at least in the context of marketing and how marketing work gets done. And my interpretation of the question is, how do you know when to restructure? How do you know there's something wrong in the way we're organized and we need to shift things around? And I look at coordination costs as a good signal. And things like this, like, is role sort confusion beginning to grow in the organization? Are people beginning to sense that, I thought that was my job, why are you doing that? Right? Those conversations, those small hassles are signals that we're incurring higher coordination costs. Or when duplication of effort begins to show more clearly, like like the corporate office did something and passed it to the regional units, and they thought, that doesn't work, we need to redo it. And when basically you're beginning to think that there's a slow to market, you're getting slow to market because decisions are being revisited and revisited and revisited. All those three are examples of behaviors that are giving you signals that coordination costs are increasing. And I think that that's a good sensor for you to determine, what, maybe my current organization structure is running out of steam. Maybe I'm out of fit with what's needed. And that could, to me, it's a moment to reconsider.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. The way I think about it is, we want people making decisions, making choices, who have the best information about that particular decision, the best information and the best skills more generally. And when you, I guess what your team is, I guess maybe out of balance, if you find yourself having to make choices for which you don't have the best information, and that might be a sign that it might be time to do some of that restructuring. And the coordination cost, part of that coordination cost comes through or manifests in what we often hear talked about as silo behavior, where people are making decisions within a silo of what's good for my particular team or my particular division, and it's not necessarily what's good for the organization as a whole. So one way to deal with that is through a recalibration or restructuring of the organization. But there's other things that we can do to try to solve some of those problems that might not need to go to the extent of a reorganization. And those can be, rethinking maybe what the performance measures that we're using to evaluate people and incentivizing people, and also investing in potentially systems to help the transfer of information. So investing in kind of information systems. So sometimes it's not a matter of kind of fixing the problem, but figuring out ways to mitigate some of the coordination costs that Omar is talking about.
Hey, thank you so much. I want to reiterate our great appreciation to our panelists and to the whole team for pulling this kickoff of a series together. We're looking forward to bringing you more great content in the next few months. Just a quick reminder, this was recorded, so everyone who registered will receive the recording and the follow-up within 24 hours. If you have any questions, we will have the contact information for our panelists in that as well. With that, I will wish you all good health and a great rest of your Tuesday, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thank you.